Hi y'all, it's Grant. This is a continuation of the overview of the GRROM, my many-dimensional knowledge graph of A Song of Ice and Fire. In the previous video, I went over some basic concepts of a knowledge graph about, kind of conceptually what one is and how we can store all these different kinds of data in one place. And in this video, I want to talk a little more about why I'm doing this or why I've chosen to do this with this subject, and kind of some of the places where the data that's going to go into this structure is coming from, and where they come from, and then furthermore, what are some of the things that are actually in there. I've sort of described a few loose things, but I've got there's a better list. So first off, why am I using A Song of Ice and Fire for this? It's beyond the fact that I like it and whatnot. This is quite a lot of work to put into something, and it's not for its own sake. It's because, as it turns out, it's because I want to know how to do this kind of stuff in general, for personal and professional reasons. I just like the way that this stuff works, and it needs a subject to work on. And so I landed on this. I said, there's many things like it. I've done some similar work with Marvel Comics and things like that. Large stuff. There's got to be a substantial amount of stuff. So I've sort of boiled it down into this list of why I like this. First of all, it's large. There are, as I said, this thing is quite big. There are thousands of characters, literally. There are hundreds of thousands of data points of the nodes, of the nouns that like we talk about, including every single word that's in the thing, and every single person, and every single place and thing, and all those things. All of those things are nodes, and that's a very sizable set, hundreds of thousands. That's non-trivial. And between those hundreds of thousands, there's going to be millions, or more likely billions, of connections between those individual nodes. To say, something as trivial as this, as this node comes after this node in a sequence, or that this person lives in this place, or this person said this thing. All of those would be connections to all of those nodes, and yeah, there's hundreds of thousands of nodes, millions or billions of connections, and so that is a substantially sized thing. Now, that's nothing that the modern databases can't handle. These are designed for that. So I'm not pushing the boundaries of the database. I'm trying to learn what I'm trying to push the boundaries of is how we store the data or how we store the knowledge that we think about some random subject. This could be done with any book. Or any book series. It makes a little more sense when the larger it gets, the more it makes sense. Think of it like a super wiki, like an even more cross-sectioned wiki that is read by a computer, and it gives you kind of the things that matter. In the real world, there's a product called Wolfram Alpha that this is somewhat similar to in concept, and a smart search kind of. Anyway, the other aspect of this is that it is finite. Despite its hugeness, you can see the edges. There are this many things, but there's not an infinite amount of things. So we have to be able to see the boundaries of it, check it against something, which is the third thing. It is verifiable, which means that there is a true version, which is a source material as it's published. Right? We published a book. The book contains words. Those words are the ultimate source. Right? Like anything else can be traced back to that. It must be. Now, that's not to say that there can't be real world references or outside of the universe references or whatever. Like when we talk about the Muppet Tullys, for example, Kermit and Elmo and Grover Tully. It would be worth having a pointer to Wikipedia or something to say, or to some, any thing. Just a little thing saying this is a reference to yada yada yada. So there would be data points that do represent other things, but not necessarily the focus of the thing. The focus of the thing is verifiable back to the source material, and so it's very important that we can follow that chain. Otherwise, how do we know we're doing it right? There's a million products that kind of do a half-assed version of what I've got of what I'm trying to make here, but it's all like a shotgun approach. Here, I'm going to throw an algorithm against something and hope for the best, and if we get 90%, then great. I don't want that. I want something that we can trace all the way back. And that goes along with it being well documented. This is and popular. The Song of Ice and Fire fandom is mostly because of Game of Thrones is very meticulous. Let's say that there's a lot of people going through this thing very tediously, and putting together data that can be thought of as more or less reliable because it's being constantly peer reviewed by a group of people that is large enough that peer review means something. That there's enough people that care about different aspects of it that they would go and make a list, and that somebody else would care enough to check that list. And so I've managed to find some basic sources for the major themes of the thing in this way. I'm certainly have no interest in thinking of and documenting every little thing myself. What I can do here is take that current documentation and put it all together. So. Along the way, suggest sort of ways, provide a platform for updating particular things, right? If it's it may not be that that current storage methods are always the best way or whatever, but it can be. The documentation can be worked with. So, along with being popular for there's a lot of data sources, it's popular in that somebody might actually give a shit about this thing and be able to use it. There's a pocket industry of people who make their living doing this, and I think that's fantastic. I support them. I'm building this essentially for people like that who have an academic or a professional reason for being able to dig deep into this data, or just somebody who likes doing that sort of thing, I guess. But but many people have an actual interest in this, and what I imagine is them going through and trying to do this meticulously, separately, and everybody repeating a lot of work. Now that's great for verifying central sources. That's not so great when you're trying to when some person is trying to make a living by creating content based on something that they're having a harder, that they may have a more or less hard time gathering data from. And there are different resources, notably a website called A Search of Ice and Fire, which do something similar, although that is a basic word search and more of a quote engine, which this is not meant to be. So this is not by any means a replacement for that. That's already doing the job that it should be doing, I think, quite well. But some of the work, some of the functionality of that would be subsumed within this, and that it could perform the same function. But I think what I have in mind is not putting out, individual quotes so much as actual data. And I'll get into that more when I go into the outputs and that sort of a thing. But it's all it's all still up in the air. I'm still building a great amount of this, but the foundational stuff is all there and working. Yeah. So anyway, popular. This could potentially have a user base. And finally, it's expandable. As I was talking about with the Muppet Tollies, there are all kinds of references to real-world things, a good amount of that pocket industry has to do with people finding the connections in real world things and mythology or pop culture or whatever, and putting these things together. And Yeah, like I said, there's not a reason in the world why this database couldn't be expanded to include all of those things and fingers out into the real world. So this thing doesn't have to exist in complete isolation. An even better thought that I've long held with this is that because this is a generic process that I've developed or am developing, this could literally be done with any work. You could take Star Wars or something, make these same lists that I'm making, plug it in, and it would work the same way. So that's another way that it's expandable. Is it's repeatable, right? Because there's nothing inherent in the data, with one exception, with the exception of the way that I work the calendar, which would be unique to each internal universe. But with the exception of the way I work the calendar, everything else is completely generic. It's lists of characters and places and that sort of thing, but that could be almost anything. There's some fields that are specific to Song of Ice and Fire, like house words and that sort of thing that doesn't matter so much for something like Star Wars. But probably in some corner of Star Wars it does matter, so I don't know. Anyway, the methodology is meant to be generic. This isn't something that is, like I said, I'm going through line by line and this can only work for this. No. The whole point is that I'm learning how this stuff works and being able to plug anything into it. So with that, let's see about the actual sources of data that I have. And that is the core sources. There's not really that many of them. The main thing, of course, is the text itself, and that is various sources online. Gets you the text, and I've done some handwork with it, mostly just cleaning up text files, essentially, and then I have and then programmatically parse it apart and do things with it. In addition, there are resources that I found online. In particular, there is a chapter-based Excel file that is curated by members of Westeros.org. It's been there for many years now, and there is I found another one that is the houses that was curated by a Reddit user called Shadowclaimer. And there were two data files that, from this guy Calvin, a Reddit user K Centurion, who had a character-based set and another set that related those characters to their mentions within chapters. An invaluable resource, and I think totally unique. And I've been working with those data sets for years. And there is a modern character-based set, which is more complete, by Reddit user Tamaris, which is got more fields in it. I have not put all of that stuff. I have not integrated that yet. That's something that, but his work is very complete, and it's up to date because he included Fire and Blood. So there's other things that have that are there, like the wiki of Ice and Fire, which you can cull data from that sort of automatically if you do it. I've done that in the past, and it's of limited value because that data is structured very loosely. There are some things like the data boxes and things like that which can yield some useful results. I have visited that in the past, but have not done so in a while. Mostly this has to do with how can I get organized data that is that fits with the stuff that I already have, and there are different kinds of connections that I can make in different ways to do this. So that's the kind of the game of this thing, or the work of the labor of this thing, is saying let's take all of these different things, reformat them in the program in such a way that they all sort of match up together, and shove them into this database in a way that makes sense. And that's what's going on. So those are the sources of data that I have. Now, from those, I'm culling uh, you know, all this stuff. This is a mostly complete list, I think, of the things that that have already been covered in one way or another. Many of them are only conceptual in the sense that I don't have everything flagged that should be flagged, but I have the mechanism working, and put it and basically have it so that as something gets filled in, it can get updated automatically and you know ultimately contain all of the connections that would come from these. But when you think of when I talked about the nodes being the things, that would be these data elements. Um, each one of these things would be a different node, a different kind of node. So when I think about timeline, there's actually a calendar. There's nodes for a calendar itself, and there's nodes for every month, and every a different node for every year, and a different node for every for days that matter. Um, Locations. I described the hierarchical nature of the location tree, and to say that we could get to somewhere very specific from somewhere very large. So each level of that would have nodes for whatever is appropriate. So a broom closet inside of a house, inside of a town, inside of a county, inside of an area, inside of a continent, inside of a planet is a whole thing, and we don't need to cover every closet, but every place that is mentioned within the context of the story should have a place. So that's locations. And then there would be things having to do with the human sort of populations, which would be things like this: the cultures that they are, the Dothraki versus the Andals or whatever, surnames that are used within those, which may be shared among many different houses and stuff. But there's the family organizations, and there are things like the actual organizations, like the Maesters of the Iron Bank and things like that. There are vocations, which are the jobs that somebody might have regardless. A banker may not necessarily work for the Iron Bank, but that's his vocation. A woodcutter, whatever. And then there are things that are pieces of the world, materials, stone, iron, wood, whatever, things that make up other things, stuff, and then flora and fauna of different ways. So a taxonomy of the actual species that exist, and we can say with humans just being one of those things, and then there are symbols, which are things which are that are not only actual in-world icons, but things that the things that may stand for other things. Arya's Arya's faceless men coin, for example, is there. It has multiple meanings, and so symbols is kind of a way of covering. There's different ways of tying things together, but I believe we need something along the lines of symbols to say that not just the color green, but the color green meaning something or other. And those would have to be necessarily, kind of different things. You'll have to think of them differently. And so there's items which might be, a sword that is made out of the material, right? Or one of Sansa's cloaks or something that are a dress or something that is like that would be an item made out of a material, which would be the different things. And so there's comestibles. We know there's lots of those, and you got to think of like every piece of food that George described. Now, something that you can eat is different than the a steak is different than the cow that steak comes from in that sense, and we need to account for both of them. So we would have both fauna and comestibles. Well, I guess flora and fauna and comestibles. So everything that's a comestible is, by default, unless you're a rock biter, is flora or fauna, right? So there's a lot of overlap in all of this stuff, right? Or like a lot of times, the notion of there being, pig may be as a pig, or it may, meaning I'm thinking of this as the notion of a pig, or it may be the pig that's, being served for dinner, and we have to be able to account for both. So, the nobility structure and the notion of kings or archons or what have you is its own data structure, which people that are part of the nobility will fit in. What is a lord in relation to a king, or whatever. And there are also like offices, right? Warden of the West. That means that's part of something, right? It's part of another structure. And then the characters, of course. Now all that stuff we're just getting to the characters. Okay, so there's events, or there rather characters who do stuff. Events, which are things that get done. That's the fifth. Events is probably the most complex structure and the farthest one away. There are epochs, which are chunks of the time. I guess that goes along with the timeline. There are chunks of the timeline. And then there's the pieces of the corpus, which are the books, the chapters within the books, scenes within the chapters, and what I call fragments, which are the pieces of scenes. There are also peripheral things like paragraphs, which are clumps or chunks of fragments, or actually sentences. There are several other layers, and the way the corpus works is a whole other thing that I'm not even going to go into here. But basically, there are these things, and finally the lexicon, which or you can think of it as an ontology, the actual all of the word, just the list of words that get used, right? Every word and every variation of a word is technically its own thing, and they relate to each other in many different ways. So all of these things are going to be, like I said, hundreds of thousands of nodes. If not, it may get into the millions, but I think it would probably be under 1 million nodes. But certainly hundreds of thousands, at least 300,000 is my guess. I would maybe not more than 5. We'll see. It's many things could be added, but part of this, part of the design process in this is keeping it to where we don't have, it's where when we talk about Ned, there is only one node for Ned, right? So that's one of several 100,000. Millions a lot. Millions a lot of things. Anyway, these other pieces here are talking about lexing, and I'll get more into that when I get into how the thing is torn apart and stored. But ultimately, when you think of lexing, it's like take any given word. What does that word maybe mean, or what does that word have like as types of associations that there might be with a word, right? So for word X, we want to know explicitly if, and it's not necessarily just a word. It may be like a single word. It might be several words that are used together, right? So I think of it as a term rather than a word. So a word is the, but a term might be the Red Keep, right? Well, that's a location, right? So that's it's how do you what things can you say these things are, right? So when we think about names, which we can say, like you could say, let's take if you take every word and you say some of these words have capital letters in front of them. And some of them have capital letters because of the beginning of a sentence, but some of them are names, right? Circe is a name. Winterfell is a name, right? Those things, the Sunset Sea is a name. Those things are treated differently than non-names. So if they are a name, if we've identified it as a name deep inside the thing, then it knows that it's got to be something like this. I've got to be a place, or I've got to be the name of a culture. I've got to be a last name, a surname, a last name. which is sometimes separate from the house names, right? Because I would associate Joy Hill with the Lannisters, but her surname is Hill, and her house name is Lannister. So those are different things like that. And then organizations, the Maesters or the Faceless Men or whatever, those are names of things. And then of course the characters themselves, each one is a different name. Some of them won't have names. Some of them are just mentioned as a non-named person. Luckily, one of the data sources takes some of that into account. So, and then for things that aren't names, they might be related to any things. Now, this is not by any means what I think of as a final list, but this is a list that I've got going right now. And out of the 30,000 or so individual words, I have flagged a lot of crap. Just kind of over time, just saying this I think is this or this or this, and each one may be different things, but I've got all of these things as sort of like these are buckets, right? Any word might go into any one of these buckets, right? So if the word bleed is in house words, if it's in anybody's house words, or if it's in a description of their sigil, right? If you say a boar, right, then that's going to be associated with the Craycalls or whatever. And then, many different ways of referring to colors. Things that amber might be a color, but it might also be a material. So, that would receive two different flags there for that. And it's also probably somebody's, and I don't know where it is. But it's, anyway, there's different things like that. There's measures of feet, inches, or whatever. I mean, to say that like when we're measuring things, when we talk about leagues, this is so many leagues away as a distance of things. Those are things that are measurements, and those need to be treated. We need to know what they are because we need to know what they refer to. There are many numbers, like individual numbers that are, sometimes the number of something, but like numbers are numbers, and they need to, and like sometimes they're listed as in lots of different ways. So with numbers, we can say that this term is a number. Furthermore, it is this number, right? Because it's written out. You don't necessarily sometimes it may be somebody drawn out the word and he says 1, but there's 5 O's. Well, you need to know you need to sort of separately flag that that's a number and it means the number 1, because it's not necessarily that you're going to parse the meaning out of all of them. So you need to flag them, and that's what this is going on. That's lexing, putting things into groups. Some things talk about time. Some things are names of plants or animals. Some things are types of clothing or the symbols that I mentioned before. Some things are man-made items, and some things are natural items. I found that when I started flagging, a sword is different than a fallen tree, that type of thing. And then the comestibles, which will become nodes. Different vocations or skills, different titles or the honorifics, Mr., Sir, whatever. And then physical traits, scarred, fat, whatever, things that would be things that are like things that are possible descriptions of people. That's physical traits. And then relations, words like daughter, nephew, whatever, like the father, those things that would indicate relation between two people. And then there's things like sounds, which are alternates, which are both, like ugh or whatever, but also things that I think of as like either colloquial or whatever, or something like the way that Varga Hout talks, right? Like when he the representation of a stammer is it means the word that he means, not not the stammered writing of the word. So those things can be flagged separately to say that this is a word that means another word. And then things like architecture and geography, which are man-made features are natural features instead of items, right? A house or a castle is architecture, and a forest is geography. So those are the types of things that are currently in the list. Now, this list can be made to be anything. It could be there could be very specific Lexing things. I thought of something like, some tinfoil theory like Tyrion Targaryen or something. You can say that a whole Lexing group is words that or pieces that associate with with a theory or something like that. You could almost add theories to the different data elements or things like that. But arguments, basically, lines of reasoning, literally lines of reasoning, are drawn between these nodes, and that's kind of what this whole thing is about. So I want to talk about next. I think I'm going to talk about the workflow, and I think this is part of that. So I would say that that's all I want to look at in this video. But I think that's a good kind of continuation of the overview of like what all is actually in this and why I'm what pieces we're starting with, and kind of what we want to what we kind of want to track with it, and as these go on, I'll get a little more into next. I'll get into the workflow, and then kind of an overview of like how the workflow works and what it's for, and then get into a little more about how some of the individual pieces work. But I think that's it for this one, and see you in the next one.